to do a little prelude to the 5 talks. This is the first in the series of 5 talks. These talks are from a book I'm working on called Approaching Spirituality. You'll hear that expression several times in each talk. It would be accurate to say that the talks are about the way I've come to notice reality. Specifically, I've noticed that I have 2 primary inner voices. One voice is the voice of an image that has been created throughout my life. It's the voice of ego. And its primary characteristics are need and fear. It joins with other people's needs and fears to create a reality that is based on need and fear. If you doubt that, you haven't looked around. This ego voice is loud and continuous. The other voice, the voice of my soul, requires that I observe and learn from my experience and from other soulful individuals. Its characteristics are contentment and love. Contentment is the opposite of need, and love is the opposite of fear. This voice is quiet and requires an invitation. Listening to the voice of soul is my spiritual intention. In summary, the 5 talks are about reducing the voice of ego and enlivening the voice of soul. The workshops are about turning the concepts of the talks into tools for personal empowerment and transformation. This first talk is called Habitual Patterns and Consciousness. To approach spirituality is to expand our in-the-moment awareness. The gist of this talk is to look at how habitual behavior absorbs a chunk of our awareness, our consciousness. To attend to habit is to be wrapped in the mental fog of need, consumed by thoughts connected to the habit and emotions that flow from the thoughts. The point is that all of this can be dissolved in the light of our consciousness. The workshop that follows the talk has 13 handouts, exercises, and readings that can be used to identify, understand, monitor, reduce, or eliminate a behavioral pattern that is causing a problem or just getting in the way of expanded consciousness. This talk doesn't have a credits page, so I want to take a minute to thank 2 women. One of them is named Crystal Todd. She's a therapist in Arizona that I've become friends with, and she has willingly agreed to provide editorial oversight for this material. And the other is Tanya Kieselbach. And while Crystal provides very specific content feedback, Tanya, being an instructor, looks more at the overall picture of things and makes suggestions relating to the structure of my talks. I appreciate both of these women dearly. They're very smart, and I'm fortunate to know them. There are 4 levels of attachment to a habitual behavior.
Come on.
1, it's non-existent. It's not a behavior that a person engages. 2, casual. A behavior that a person engages in a chosen, balanced, non-problematic way. 3, abusive, a behavior that a person engages with some level of excessiveness and negative consequences. And 4, addictive. Despite mounting negative consequences, the person has lost control of the behavior. When a person is in denial about a behavior becoming abusive or addictive, it's the consequences that are being denied. Pulling habits into our awareness is a logical first step toward reclaiming the consciousness we need to continue approaching spirituality. Habits aren't just things we do, they're also thought and emotion patterns. This first chapter is about what habits are, how they both reward and punish us, their unconscious underpinnings, and their connection to our brain chemistry. Anything we find enjoyable triggers the release of dopamine, a chemical produced in the brain that feels good and functions as a motivator. It's easy to see why some things that we really enjoy can become habits, as they trigger an unnaturally large supply of dopamine, which feels really good. However, with large amounts of dopamine, motivation gets distorted. We lose sight of priorities, especially spiritual priorities. What gets distorted by unnaturally high levels of dopamine is our sense of why we have this life to begin with. Habits develop as solutions to uncomfortable thoughts. The nature of a habit is that it relieves a symptom, such as stress or anxiety, from uncomfortable thinking, without solving the underlying problem. Habits get worse because we unconsciously think that increasing the thing that hasn't worked will do the trick. More of a habit is likely to take it to a new level of attachment, maybe from abusive to addictive. The word preferences has a lot to do with habits. We prefer comfort and pleasure to discomfort and pain. We are experimenters from birth, always experimenting with behaviors in an effort to achieve our preferences. Habits form when we try out a behavior and discover that it does indeed get us what we want. At least in the short term, we tried it and it worked. As a baby, crying got us what we wanted. Later, not so much. All habitual behaviors involve the release and reuptake of the brain's neurotransmitter chemicals, primarily dopamine, and to a lesser degree serotonin, which regulates mood, sleep, and appetite, and adrenaline, which triggers the fight or flight response. Certain cells in the brain release these chemicals, and their presence in our brain gives us the feel-good we're looking for. What we're talking about here is the brain's pleasure circuitry. A person with a gambling or shopping or gaming addiction is seeking the same thing that a drug addict is seeking: dopamine. Drugs and behaviors release dopamine. Even romantic love can involve the basic quest for dopamine. A behavior doesn't have to be negative to become an addiction, which is why we have words like workaholic. With habits and addictions, a person is putting so much mental and physical resources into serving habit or addiction that legitimate needs are going unmet. They've lost a sense of balance. Our physical and mental and spiritual selves are always seeking balance, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. And our habits and addictions, with the consent of our ego, are always seeking to maintain a distracting imbalance. In our society, balance has become associated with boring to the extent that if it's not unnaturally exciting, it's boring. We see this shift in the entertainment industry, where it used to be common for movies to have in-depth character studies with complex characters. Now we have blockbusters with exciting special effects contained within simplistic good versus evil plot lines. A closer look at the ego comes in later chapters, but for now we need to understand that the ego uses our habits and addictions to remain the king in our thinking process. The ego tells us that our habits and addictions improve our enjoyment of life. The ego tells us what we want to hear. So we will keep letting it pretend to be who we are. In regards to our habits, the ego says, just do it. Don't examine, just do. Pleasure seeking can be the ego seeking the feeling of safety. Remember in the prelude, I said the ego's primary characteristics are need and fear. Pleasure is an exaggerated form of comfort, and our ego confuses comfort with safety. To reach comfort and pleasure, we have to eliminate thoughts that create discomfort and pain. A habit or addiction gives us something else to think about. An addiction or habit is a means to an end, the end being distraction from unpleasant thoughts and or feelings. Pleasure is great at providing a distraction, and the more dopamine that is released, the more pleasure we feel, and the more distracted we are. From this perspective, we might see distractions as protecting us from pain until we gather the courage and wisdom we need to confront our pain with truth. It stands to reason that the more pain we have in our history, the more susceptible we are to addiction. And studies have proven this. When pleasure seeking becomes excessive or repetitive, or daily as I like to call it, it causes changes in our brain's pleasure circuitry. As the pleasure circuitry gets overworked, it tries to protect us from too much excitement. We're programmed to survive, and too much excitement leads to decisions that can be dangerous. The brain adjusts by trimming off some of the dopamine circuitry. This trimming also means that we don't return to an acceptable baseline of happiness when we abstain from a drug or habit that has reached an abusive or addictive stage. We return to something below that in the direction of depression and or anxiety. Some of this is because whatever we're trying to distract ourselves from is still there, waiting for a spiritual solution. Many things trigger a release of dopamine into our brain, and many of those things are the relatively trivial experiences of life. Someone smiling at us, a new or novel experience, an accomplishment, a feeling of connection to another human being, a walk in nature, unity of Oroville. Once we've altered our brain chemistry by chasing exaggerated releases of dopamine and the trimming has occurred, these simple pleasures don't provide enough dopamine to keep us motivated. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our efforts worked, if we could pleasure our pain away, if we could bury it? It isn't going anywhere. These efforts to eliminate suffering don't work, or they wouldn't become habits and addictions. Becoming conscious of this futility turns our failed efforts into the powerful truth that our patterned habits aren't working. Emotional pain, from a spiritual perspective, is our most powerful teacher. Curiosity can sustain us while we experiment with abstaining from a habit. Becoming interested in everything that is happening in the moment will carry us. We can learn to become interested in all that a moment has to offer. The moods and emotions, the influence of the past, the concerns about the future, the myriad assumptions we attach to all of that, and the truths that lie beneath the assumptions. There's always another layer of experience to be examined underneath whatever is arising. We can become fascinated with sorting through the complexities of our existence to discover the simple truths of spirituality. Being interested combats boredom and releases a sustaining stream of motivated dopamine. We can also use hope and prayer to release dopamine. However, hope and prayer can also be an excuse to avoid the real work of resolving the anxieties that drove us toward habitual behaviors in the first place. Hope and prayer are useful in regards to maintaining awareness of our intentions and letting reality, one of the terms I use in place of God, know that we are seeking an expansion in our awareness. My thoughts on a God may be different from some others, but that reality responds to our intentions is without question. Hope and prayer can devolve into us wanting change without effort or suffering. Giving up a habit can cause emotional suffering, given the chances are they develop to help us bury emotional suffering that will now come to the surface. I call this legitimate suffering because it ultimately leads to healing. Illegitimate suffering is that which is experienced without understanding. Suffering for the sake of expanding our consciousness will lead to healing. Our patterned habitual behaviors do not. For a successful approach to spirituality, we must re-envision emotional suffering, see it as something that is perfect in the moment because it is what is arising for examination. We can see it as something that will pass, and until it does, something that is interesting and worthy, not something foisted upon us randomly or as punishment. We can identify our suffering as being entirely related to our personality, which is not our spiritual essence. We can think of suffering as a phenomenon related to our existence, something that happens purposefully to all of us. Suffering isn't happening to us, it's just happening. The paradoxical problem is that while providing immediate and temporary relief, hope and prayer can mute the possibilities that any given moment offers for learning. Nothing takes us away from a complete examination of what is, like hoping and praying for things to be different. Things being exactly the way they are is exactly what God wants for the sake of our learning. That thing you're hating is probably happening right on time. Hope, although required in the beginning of our journey toward transcendence, must eventually be transcended. Initially, hope produces the dopamine we were getting from unhealthy behaviors. We need natural levels of dopamine for motivation. It's fine to hope and pray for a better head, heart, and physical space. But hope and prayer can also be a fog that shrouds what reality is trying to teach us. Sometimes we pray as if God has been holding out. That's never the case. God simply knows better what we need. The result of prayer in my early recovery from addiction was that I lost contact with the memory of what the drug high felt like. I didn't pray for that outcome because I didn't even think of it. I just prayed for assistance. Through the chapter topics and workshop exercises, we're going to be dealing with what is, not what we hope is. We'll be praying for assistance, clarity, courage, and willingness. Not for God to remove the suffering that is there to teach us. The exercises in these chapters healed me. And I believe they were a manifestation of assistance from a higher source. This first chapter and the following exercises are about examining our habits and experimenting with taking our power back from them. Conversely, it is about establishing new, consciously chosen routines. The workshops take power from our ego so that the voice of our soul can become prominent. The voice of soul tells me over and over that the wisdom I receive must be shared. Within our habits, we find cycles of desire where there is little or no opening for approaching spirituality. That's why desire is a hot topic within all valid wisdom traditions. In the beginning of our approach to spirituality, we need to become conscious of our habitual patterns and examine the nature of desire. In the chapters and exercises that follow, we will begin to unravel the obstacles to clarity and reclaim the consciousness that is our birthright. The workshop for this chapter is full of exercises and readings that help with this. Some of you are about to embark on a wild and beautiful ride, not out into the cosmos, but in where the true mystery resides. Namaste.
Namaste.